So welcome to everybody. First of all, let me introduce myself. My name is Simon Trace. I am a principal consultant at Oxford Policy Management and director of the Energy and Economic Growth Applied Research Programme, funded by FCDO, the UK government. Just a very brief introduction to the programme itself. The Energy and Economic Growth Applied Research Programme, also known as EEG for short. It's funded, as I say, by FCDO. It's been running now for about 5 years. Our focus is on grid-scale electricity infrastructure and the factors that affect the degree to which its development supports economic growth and jobs in developing countries. We have 4 key research themes. These are around how to promote access to the grid, how to ensure reliability of grid supplies. We look at the factors affecting energy efficiency and the productive use of grid electricity, and then how to incorporate large-scale variable renewables into grid supplies. We sponsored around 30 research projects to date, with a range of academic and research institutions, 4 of whom are represented here today, and who I'll introduce in a minute. From Oxford Policy Management, I'm also joined by my colleague Ben Clus, who's Head of Research and Engagement for the EEG programme, and he will be performing a function around questions, which I will come back to in a second. So this webinar is one of a series exploring this sort of emerging body of evidence from the Applied Research Programme on Energy and Economic Growth. We know that electricity utilities in developing countries are financially challenged, with many operating at a loss. Non-technical losses, which include electricity theft and bill non-payment, cost utilities an estimated $96 billion a year worldwide, with nearly a quarter of that happening in India alone. As a case is often made for smart meters or prepaid meters as part of a utility strategy to reduce non-technical losses and improve cost recovery, and thus sort of provide the investment necessary to improve services and break a cycle of low cost recovery and therefore low investment. This webinar is going to bring together leading experts to draw on research carried out in Bangladesh, Ethiopia, Kyrgyzstan, India and Pakistan, and we're going to really look at sort of 4 questions. Evidence around the effectiveness of a strategy of using smart meters or prepaid meters to reduce losses. Insights on whether the use of prepaid meters or postpaid smart meters produce different results. Looking at the impact of the introduction of smart or prepaid meters on consumer behaviour, including evidence of whether usage drops or changes, and whether this is a good or a bad thing for poor consumers. And then we're going to look at the political economy of the challenges, and some of the political economy challenges of introducing prepaid or smart meters. So that's what we're going to be looking at. What I want to do now is to introduce our panelists, and they are as follows in alphabetical order. Abebe Beyene, who is senior researcher senior research fellow at the Environment and Climate Research Centre at the Policy Studies Institute in Ethiopia. Anant Sudarshan, who's South Asia Director at the Energy Policy Institute at the University of Chicago and is based currently in India. Debasish Das, who is Assistant Professor at the University of Khulna in Bangladesh, but is currently based at the Australian National University in Canberra. And Robyn Meeks, who's Assistant Professor at Sanford School of Public Policy at Duke University. And then just finally, in terms of the introductions, some housekeeping rules, just to let you know that attendees will not be visible or audible, but you can ask questions, and there is a Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. If you move the cursor at the bottom of the screen, you see a Q&A function. If you want to ask a question, please type it in there, and what we'll do is once every sort of 15 or 20 minutes, we'll stop the conversation and try and answer as many questions that have sort of come up in the Q&A area there, and my colleague Ben will be keeping an eye on that and bringing them together to interject them into the proceedings at that point. Please also keep an eye on the chat. Chat function is also there on the bottom of the screen. You're welcome to post comments and reflections there as opposed to questions. But we will also be posting links to relevant research papers and other documents as the webinar proceeds. And then it's finally to let you know that the webinar is being recorded and it will be available through EEG's website at a later date. So with that done, let's start. And I'm going to start my questions with Robyn, and maybe start with something around definitions around smart meters. So, Robyn, there's a sort of range of functionalities and benefits. There are different technologies, automated meter reading versus advanced metering infrastructure. Can you just expand a bit on the different sort of metering technologies and functionalities?
Sure. So as an economist by training, not an engineer, I had to do a lot of learning when I first started working in this area to try and understand the different technologies and the different functionalities that they come with. So one of the big distinctions that I had to learn personally first when I was working in this area was the difference between AMR and AMI meters or systems. So AMR being automatic meter reading systems, and AMI being advanced metering infrastructure. So with the AMR, typically the functionalities it involves some sort of meter that's installed at the customer's location, telecommunication technologies to allow the meter reading, and some sort of computer and software system at the utility that allows analysis of the data. But how it differs from the advanced metering infrastructure, the AMI, is that the AMI is actually typically providing some sort of continuous two-way communication between the utility and the consumer. So typically, and this does vary depending on the actual metering technology available, but typically there is an ability to have communication between the utility and the customer in high frequency. So it could be every 15 minutes, the data might be sent back and forth between the customer and the utility. And this can provide a number of different types of information that's sent between the two, whether it be on pricing information can be sent to the customer, but then also the utility can be getting information in real time about consumption, but also information about any sort of issues that might be arising throughout the distribution system, whether it be sort of voltage fluctuations or outages and things like that. So the utility could use that information to respond to various issues within the distribution system. But like I said, there are big variations in the types of functionalities that are available with different meters. And so with any of these infrastructure projects, sort of understanding the available functionalities is sort of the key part, the key first step in sort of understanding what impacts they might have.
Okay, and we'll come back to that a bit in some of the questions later on to all of the panelists, I guess, which one of those functionalities have been available or exploited. We also have prepaid meters, and I guess smart meters can be prepaid or postpaid, but we can just have very simple prepaid meters that don't have any smart functionality at all. Is that correct?
That's how I understand it, that the smart meters can have the functionality of being prepaid. I think there's people on this call that have more experience with prepaid meters than I do. I personally haven't been working in settings with prepaid meters, but as I understand it, the prepaid meters could be within a set of smart meters, or they could be a simpler set of meters. Okay,
so that's got some definitions out of the way. Thanks for that, Robyn. I mean, just continuing with your research then. So you looked at the sort of experience of implementing smart meters and some other technologies, and we'll come back to other technologies later, but they were aimed at revenue collection in Karachi, but more, I think, more in depth in 3 utilities in Kyrgyzstan. Can you just sort of sum up that research project just in a couple of sentences and the sort of objectives and methodology?
Right. So for both of these projects, we were trying to understand how different technologies in the distribution system might have sort of helped or assisted utilities in their response, both to sort of typical issues in that utilities deal with, but also how they might have benefited the utilities in their response to the COVID-19 pandemic, sort of any additional issues that arose for utilities then. So we looked in Kyrgyzstan with 3 different utilities where we surveyed the utility workers there to understand how they felt like smart meters had been used or helped or them in the response to COVID-19. And then we did a larger study in Pakistan to understand how different distribution infrastructure technologies had helped them in the sort of responding to the COVID-19 pandemic.
Okay, and the sort of technologies that were being used and the sort of functionalities that were being attempted to be used there, if you could just sort of touch on those quickly.
Yes. So in Kyrgyzstan, smart meters have been installed in all of the utilities that we were studying. We studied 3 out of the 4 utilities. So we were finding about 20% of the residential consumers had smart meters installed, and about 33% of industrial consumers had smart meters installed. So that was sort of one of the main technologies, smart meters with these two-way communication functionalities that we were studying there. In our study in Pakistan, we were focused in Karachi, and there smart meters have been installed much less than where we were studying in Kyrgyzstan. So what we were seeing there was more a different type of technology, aerial bundled cables, that we were sort of more focusing on in our study there, given that was the technology that had been installed more pervasively throughout that distribution system.
Okay. And from your previous, you were doing some work in Kurdistan before EEG funded this particular work, which is sort of looking at meters and COVID. But I think your previous research, you sort of found substantial benefits for consumers from the installation of smart meters. And it was more in terms of improved supplies as much as anything else. So was that part of the sort of feedback mechanism you were describing earlier?
Well, so what we were finding in that, so we had conducted a randomized study in Kyrgyzstan, in one city in Kyrgyzstan, prior to this more recent work that I was just mentioning. And then in that work, we worked with one electricity utility there, and smart meters were randomly installed at residential consumer locations. And we were finding evidence that the electricity quality improved after the smart meters were installed. And this was in the form of fewer voltage fluctuations. So voltage fluctuations had been a serious problem and leading to a lot of damage in appliances. And we found that those significantly reduced after the smart meters were installed. So we were finding substantial benefits to the consumers in terms of improved electricity service quality. And in that study, we were able to look at how consumers responded in terms of their appliances and their appliance use. And we find that they did indeed respond to the improvements in the electricity service quality. Now, that study was limited in that while we have over 1,000 households that were involved in that study, so we're able to say something, I think, quite conclusive about sort of the impacts for the consumers, because we were just working in one city with one utility and a limited number of neighborhoods. We're a bit more limited in terms of what we can say in terms of the benefits to the utility overall from that study. So I think the main focus of our results from that study were on that we're able to show that there were these electricity service quality improvements, and then we're able to say something about how the consumers respond to the changes in electricity service quality. And we find that they're quite substantial.
Okay. Was there any, I mean, could you make the link or explain why introduction of smart meters improved the quality of the service? Was it simply that the utility was getting better information and responding quicker to problems, or was there, I don't know, less sort of illegal tapping of lines, which might have caused problems in itself? Was there any sort of sense of how that connection was made?
Right. So we're able to provide some evidence on this, but like I said, we are limited because of the small number of transformers, that relatively small number of transformers that are included in that study. what we think is happening based on the evidence that we have is we think that that the smart meters were providing information to the electricity utility on the locations that were sort of most problematic in terms of electricity service quality. And then the utility was responding to those alerts, alarms, if you will, from the smart meters. And in their response, they were able to target those sites within the distribution network that were most problematic and target their sort of repairs, et cetera, to those locations.
Okay. Brilliant. Thanks, Robyn. I want to shift across to Anant now. And so shifting from Kyrgyzstan and Pakistan to India. I mean, Anant, you've been conducting a really large-scale neighborhood level sort of RCT trial in Haryana, in India, to see if smart metering can improve cost recovery and again, sort of reliability and access. The research hasn't quite gone the way it was originally intended, and we'll come back to some of those challenges in a second, particularly on some of its connections. But can you first just briefly summarize the intention and design of the study, and also maybe a little bit talk through a little bit about how utilities have been rolling out smart meters there, because I understand they sort of rolled them out as almost as sort of traditional analog meters to start with before switching on some of the smart functionalities. So can you talk us through that, please?
Yeah, so I think India, as with many other developing countries, is spending a huge amount of money on smart meters. It's sort of a response to what is a fairly dysfunctional electricity distribution system in these countries. And sort of, one thing people have reached out for is maybe you need better technology, right? So India is spending about $20 billion over the next 5 years. Is an estimate. It's probably an underestimate on kind of metering across the grid. So we were working with one of the Indian states, the state of Haryana, to sort of ask the question, what is achieved by changing metering. So the design was, it was a cluster randomized control trial, clusters being meter reading units, which are, houses that have traditionally been read by one meter reader. That's relevant here because one dimension on which you might expect smart meters to change things is reducing the interaction between utility officials who read meters and the consumer. And so if you're concerned about corruption or data falsification by individual staff, then that might be broken. So it was a cluster randomized trial with these clusters, and then looking at also how, are there spillovers? If you convert a lot of people to a smart meter, do you see, different outcomes from if a small fraction of the population is converted to smart metering? That just reflects the reality of the fact that you're not going to have 100% metering right away. So you might care about what that does. So that was the goal of the project, was to and then to look at sort of, okay, a smart meter is just a piece of equipment, which I think we often forget. So it's sort of meaningless until you decide what you want to use it for. And so, many utilities in India, well, they got money to install smart meters, so they're installing smart meters, but none of those smart features are being used. So one of the goals of this project was to test different elements of what a smart meter can do and try and tease out what those different elements achieve.
Okay. And I mean, what elements were you looking at, and were they all things that the utility actually wanted to try and get benefit from, or were some of them things they weren't thinking about at the time?
I mean, so you kind of have 4 levels, right? So a smart metering program, well, one thing it'll do is it'll replace old analog meters with new meters. So if you have, bad meters, you might see a change just from a new meter. Then you can do online billing. What online billing does is I don't rely on someone to go check the meter. I'm getting this data in real time. So I break that connect. You can then implement remote disconnections. That's, it's been argued that it's very expensive to disconnect people. So a smart meter makes it basically free because you can, with advanced metering infrastructure, you can cut off individual consumers. And the 4th thing you can do is change how you're billing people. And so that's a whole range of things. That's time of day tariffs, there's prepaid metering, and so on. I think the 4th of those is sort of at the at the outside limits of what Indian utilities have been thinking of so far. But about actually last week, the central government really, has issued something that is pushing hard for prepaid metering, which is a change in tariffs. So sort of trying to push utilities more towards using that with smart meters. So I'd say those are kind of the 4 levels at which you could think of using these.
Cool. And as I've hinted already, your research has faced some challenges along the way. And I think it's sort of political economy side of things that's really interesting to hear from you here, because you originally were going to be located in Bihar, but you had to shift there because there seemed to be sort of local resistance to the rollout of smart meters from the local population in general in Bihar. And then more recently, you've run into problems within the utility about following protocols to actually use the smart features, particularly sort of remote disconnection. Can you, what you feel comfortable talking about with that, please? Can you just sort of give us some
So we've been to over the course of the EG grant, we started out in the state of Bihar, where their effort to roll out smart meters at the time sort of essentially came to a standstill because of people protesting. That's something that's been seen in different parts of the world. I remember PG&E had a lot of problems getting smart meters installed in California when they first started because there were protests. But it sort of lined up with an upcoming election and generally sort of the government being not wanting to fight that battle. And so at that time, that state kind of put their smart metering program on hold. More recently, they have been able to install many more meters. So they have overcome that or sort of blown past it a bit more recently. So we moved to another state, Haryana, which has done very well at installing the meters themselves. But I think the problem we've seen there, which I think is a generic problem for anyone pushing smart meters in general, is that it's not obvious that, so you see Indian utilities are characterized by widespread non-payment and very little enforcement of, very few disconnections, very little obvious enforcement action being taken on people who are not paying. And so the question is sort of, why is that? And is the problem a technology problem or is the problem something deeper? What we see in Haryana was they were willing to install smart meters. They started out not using them for anything. So it was just literally, we got funds for smart meters, so we installed this smart meter. They did move to using online billing, but they were not willing to actually ever implement disconnections. So we actually got told flat out by utility field staff that sort of, it's just they have too many different people coming and asking them to disconnect people or not disconnect people, officers at various levels. We're still investigating exactly what determines who gets disconnected or not. But basically, we were quite clearly told that no rule-based protocol was feasible. And so we were never able to get them to implement that. We've now moved to a third state, which is probably going to be outside of the EG grant, but it's part of the same effort. It's not, we'll see if the third state is any better. But I think it does raise this question that if you're going to be a technology advocate, you have to first prove that the reason things are bad in the status quo actually has something to do with a technical failing. And I don't think that's ever been sort of proved, so to speak, for at least South Asia. And I think we're seeing some of that in the utility use of smart meters.
Okay. So, I mean, given the issues around implementing the remote disconnection element, is there anything you can say from your research so far about sort of other effects of the rollout of smart meters in Haryana? I mean, has there been any noticeable impact on utility?
Very little. I think we have some early evidence that we're still sort of double checking that the bills might have reduced slightly with the online billing. Not by very much, but that might suggest that bills were inflated a little bit. It also suggests that collections actually go down. So if the goal of smart meters was to sort of increase how much money you're getting, we see no evidence of that. And so and as I said, if the utility has not been willing to implement, use the fact that disconnection costs have come down to zero, that hasn't meant widespread disconnections. We're still, as I said, we don't see any clear evidence in the arrears data as to something that sharply differentiates who's disconnected from who's not. They do target at people with larger arrears, but they certainly don't cover all of them. And they seem to value discretion in who gets pulled up. So I would not say that there's any evidence that the big picture goal which the Indian government has had, which is that smart meters might solve the bankrupt state utility problem where they are not able to get any money. That's not going to be solved unless they're used for one of two things. Either you change the contracts and you look at prepaid metering and so on, or you kind of enforce existing contracts. And I think what we are trying in the third state is to push more to see if we can test prepaid metering, because at least one advantage of that is it removes any discretion. Like even if it's just pressing a button, a remote disconnection through pressing a button still requires a human being to press that button. And prepaid metering algorithms mean that's even that is removed. So.
Okay. Thanks for now, Anant. We'll come back, but that's really useful. So I mean, I think what we've seen so far from Robyn and Anant is on the one hand, some potential real benefits to consumers from smart metering in terms of improvements of supply in Kyrgyzstan, and possibly a mechanism working there that utilities get better information and take action quicker. But on the other hand, sort of political economy issues around actually not just getting meters installed, but also actually having some of the functionalities switched on is a sort of a challenge, at least in India. Just want to, Ben, do we have any questions? I just want to take a quick pause and see if we have any questions from the audience.
Thanks, Simon. Thanks to the panelists so far. We don't have a question so far, although actually something's come up. But there's yes, there's one question that just came up from Anand, and it is: do manual disconnections or reconnections continue even though there's technology to do so?
Okay, well, I answered that online, but yeah, I mean, brief answer, yes, they do use the smart meters to do the disconnection. The question is not of whether you pull out the wire or you use the smart meter. I think the reluctance is to change how many people they disconnect and whether they use discretion as opposed to rules to do it. So there's always been a small amount of disconnections, and that continued. So it wasn't that the smart meters weren't used to do the disconnection. It was that they didn't change the probability of being disconnected, if you like.
Okay.
I think there's a comment that it sort of implies a question here in the chat box, which is prepaid versus post-payment mechanisms, and both seem possible to be combined with smart meters. So I think the question that it implies is does it matter whether smart meters are used when you are implementing prepaid or postpaid? And conversely, if you thought prepaid mechanisms had benefits, does it necessarily yield better results for consumers and utilities if it is combined with the rollout of smart meters?
So I think there is some recognition of these political economy problems at the highest level of the Indian government, for example. And so there is a push, as I said, and more recently an explicit push that ties sort of state funding to trying to use prepaid metering instead. I think the point is, there's nothing particularly special about prepaid metering in terms of technology. If you have a meter sending real-time data on consumption, you can link it to your billing system and implement prepaid metering at the software end with the discom, or you could have a meter that allows you to recharge in your house. So there's different ways of implementing it. The main thing it requires is real-time data on consumption, so you can kind of count down on a balance. Whether that's implemented in software at the discom end, or whether that's built into the hardware is sort of a detail. But it's not been tried yet. I mean, I don't know of any Indian state that's actually doing prepaid metering at any sort of scale, and certainly not mandatorily. And so there are some states that have tried to do voluntary opt-in into prepaid metering, and it's not even clear to me. So obviously there's been a very small number of people who opted into that. It's not clear why you'd ever want to opt into that, but it's not been mandated anywhere. So hopefully that will happen in the next year, and we'll see whether that solves some of these issues.
And I mean, you and I, Anant, have discussed before that there's a sort of third potential route, which is that you introduce prepaid meter functions for people that go into arrears. So you don't introduce it as a sort of general rule, but you don't disconnect people, but you switch them to prepaid if they're in arrears.
Yeah, I think that's something that we didn't find the Haryana utility was too keen on, but the Haryana utility, remember, is not very keen on implementing punishments on people who are not paying their bills in practice, differently from the discretion base. So you could imagine this is part of it. The new state we are trying to work with, which is Jammu and Kashmir, is one of the worst in terms of payment rates. The state of Haryana is bad. When I say bad, I mean like 30–40% loss rates. Jammu and Kashmir is like 70%. So you lose, 70 cents on the dollar from the discom end. They say they want to crack down harder in terms of mandating prepaid metering. We'll see if they do that.
Okay. Okay. Just thanks for that. Let's just encourage people, if anybody's got any questions, please do use the Q&A function to type them up, and we will try and stop again a couple of times to pick things up. Or if you want to comment, yeah, please feel free to use the chat to do so. So we're going to shift across now for a moment to prepaid meters. And of course, as we've essentially already said here, prepaid meters get around the problem of somebody having to decide whether or not to disconnect a consumer, because the consumer effectively disconnects themselves if they're not able to buy enough credit to keep the meter going. So that sort of moves that discretionary element out. I'm going to start with Debasish. You and David Stern produced a paper for EEG back in 2020 that looked at, I think it was 10 countries, and looked at sort of deployment of prepaid meters. Can you just summarize, first of all, what you found in that paper? How common are prepaid meters?
Thank you. Actually, our energy insight reports on the recent development in the adoption of prepaid meter in developing countries, particularly the Sub-Saharan Africa and the South Asian countries. And we tried to collect the information which examines the effect of prepaid metering on electricity consumption, and also the revenue collections mechanism for those for the utility companies. So first what we did, we tried to cover the current uptake of prepaid meter in this Sub-Saharan Africa and the South Asian countries. So based on the available information, so we found that 10 Sub-Saharan African countries and 4 South Asian countries, to some extent, implementing either prepaid or smart metering in a greater scale. So what we also found that the implementing this kind of meter, the main motivation was to control the non-payment bills, electricity theft, and corruptions. And this uptake, both prepaid and smart metering, is substantially increased over the time. So in South Asia, particularly Bangladesh, actually I also done a research on the impact of prepaid meter on Bangladesh. So we also shows our present our preliminary result from the Bangladesh perspective. And because in Bangladesh, I think the prepaid meter is implementing a very large scale. Currently, almost 30% of our customers nationwide is now moved to prepaid system. And I particularly done research in like considering the greater Dhaka, the capital. So where nearly 45% people like residential customer are now switched to the prepaid system. So in our like preliminary empirical result, where we found that almost like the people who switch to prepaid system, their electricity consumption decreases roughly 13%. So and also we showed the impact is quite similar in developing countries, in particular South Africa, because we found there is like very good empirical research carried out on South Africa. I think the Jack and Smith done that paper, and they shows that roughly 14% electricity the consumer reduced their electricity consumption roughly 14% when they switch to the prepaid metering system in South Africa. So basically that is all about our insight.
Right. So just to be clear, there were sort of two things going on here. One was your sort of literature review of the deployment of prepaid meters or smart meters more widely, and you found deployment across, I think it was 14 countries you mentioned in the end, South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. But then you did your own separate research study looking on the impact of prepaid meters on consumption in Bangladesh and Dhaka in particular, because there was only, I think, that one other study on the impact, wasn't there, in South Africa, and you found similar impacts. So 13%, I think you said, reduction in consumption in Dhaka as a result of following the implementation of prepaid meters, and that sort of correlates to 14% reduction that was found in South Africa. I think that's a summary, yeah?
So actually, we also did some heterogeneity based on the different tariff groups. So the impact is quite different. So that is the additional information we also explored. So
on different socioeconomic groups, or?
Yeah. So based on the tariff structure, different tariff structure of the electricity price.
Can you say a little bit more about that then?
Okay, so in Bangladesh, the electricity pricing is a block pricing system. So we have 6 block pricing, 6 blocks in the pricing mechanism. So the lower, like the people who use from 0 kilowatt to 75 kilowatt, they get the subsidized price, the least subsidized price, and the next slot is start from 76 to 200 and so on and so forth. So we saw that in the lower like tariff group, the impact of prepaid meter actually is much higher than the upper top like percentile.
Right.
So in a welfare sense, I think this one is really a concern for the policymaker, because they are using less amount of electricity, and also now when they're switching to the prepaid system, even their electricity consumption is less. So this is one concern actually when we saw that result. But and for example, in the upper quantile, like the top tariff group, we didn't find out that much significant impact of the prepaid metering switch to a prepaid meter system.
Okay.
So yeah, so that was like the additional information actually we
okay. That's really interesting. We'll come back to impact again in a minute in the discussion with the Ethiopian experience. But I mean, just the last question, Debasish, was there any evidence, and I'm not sure whether you looked at this in your Dhaka study, but there was any evidence that the the installation of prepaid meters had an impact on utility revenue? Did it benefit the utilities at all?
Well, in our research, we didn't explore that side. Yeah, so I cannot tell on that one as we didn't explore that one.
Okay, thank you very much, Debasish. I'm going to switch across to Abebe now in Ethiopia. You've just been doing a study that sort of analyzes the impact of prepaid meters through a range of lenses, including sort of quasi-experimental study in Addis Ababa that looked at sort of household consumption with postpaid and prepaid meters. So can you just describe your study briefly and comment, and maybe just also let us know how much, how prevalent prepaid meters are in Ethiopia now?
Thank you, Simon.
Everybody else switch their microphones off, and it might help. I'll do the same.
Yeah.
Go on, baby, try again. Hi, baby. Hi, baby. Are you there? Oh, that's a shame. We seem to have lost the baby just at the point at which he was coming in. We'll see if he comes back in a minute, and if that's the case, we'll go back to him. So I mean, just moving on. I mean, let's just pick up the sort of issues that we saw in India around the sort of political economy problems of installing smart meters. I mean, Robyn, your study in Pakistan, there was found there was a degree of sort of mistrust amongst utility customers who had smart meters, sort of feelings that the meters ran faster or overcharged. Does that suggest that the introduction of these meters was bringing disbenefits for poorer consumers in that particular location compared to the sort of benefits you were seeing in Kyrgyzstan?
So with that part, they weren't even necessarily smart meters that they were installing. They were just newer meters. And so shifting from an old meter to a new meter, the cost, we conducted focus groups with a number of customers and then surveys of households. And we heard from a number of people that where they felt like the new meters were not accurately counting their consumption of electricity services. And so there was this sort of distrust with the new meters. It wasn't, in this case, it wasn't specific to smart meters per se, but just these newer meters where people felt like they weren't accurately counting their consumption. Now, it might be that those meters, and in that case in Pakistan, they were more accurately counting the consumption, capturing the consumption than the old meters had. So it might be, it's very plausible that the newer meters were sort of picking up a larger amount of electricity services consumed. But there was sort of this lack of trust with the utility because of the meters that were installed, or tied to the meters that were installed.
Okay. I'm going to try and go back to Abebe again, but he seems to keep coming in and out, so I'm not sure whether he's there. Abebe, can you hear us now? No, seems not. That's a real shame. He's clearly having trouble with his connection. There is I wanted to bring him in.
Can you hear me now?
I can, yes.
Okay. Maybe, yeah, sorry for the interruption.
No, that's fine. I mean, just tell us quickly about your study in Addis of prepaid meters.
Yeah, this study is one of the outputs of the EG funded project, and the objective of the study was to really investigate the impact of prepaid meter on electricity consumption, household consumption, as well as other outcome variables like ownership of appliances and satisfaction level of the customers. We use data from the capital at least for around 1,000 households, those with prepaid and those who do not. And we use a quasi-experimental approach, mainly property score match. And the result we find that consistent with other similar studies, customers of or owners or users of prepaid meters reduce their electricity consumption by at least 13-14%, and that's actually consistent with other studies like Jack and Smith in South Africa. The result based on randomized control experiment, they found 40% reduction in electricity consumption, and we found a minimum of such 40%, but it varies depending on the type of approach or method. It goes up to 20%, and that result is consistent across the specifications. That's one. And how prevalent in terms of other outcome variables like appliance ownership, we don't find significant impact on appliance ownership. Probably this is because this is a cross-sectional data, so we may need to have kind of longitudinal data to really see impact on appliance ownership, like appliances on cooking technologies, on entertainment, and other kinds of appliances, but positively related to the satisfaction level of customers, which is good for the utility, where there is a repeated and serious complaints about the services provided by the EU. This is one indication. The prepaid is expanding now for both residential and non-residential customers. So recently I was told that there are around more than 800,000 customers in the country, both actually residential and non-residential, but I'm not sure how many of them are residential and how many are non-residential customers.
Okay. I mean, just to go back, I didn't quite catch what you were saying in the middle there. Did you? Is there any evidence that the installation of prepaid meters in Addis has had a positive impact on sort of reducing non-technical losses for EU for the utility?
Well, we haven't addressed that issue. As I said, the main objective or the main goal for the project was to look at whether that prepaid meter ownership has an impact on reducing electricity consumption. That was what we planned at the beginning, but later on we further extend that to other outcome variables like appliance ownership and level of satisfaction. But there are evidences here and there that shows that these prepaid meters reduce the technical losses and others like administration challenges, revenue, and so on. But these are, in terms of revenue, there is one rigorous study that I know, that I'm aware of, that's in South Africa, the one already mentioned by the previous speaker.
Mm.
But others, which are largely descriptive in nature, show that it has a positive impact on these issues, on revenue and reducing non-technical losses and other administrative challenges of the utility. But these are largely descriptive and not rigorous actually, and we haven't seen that aspect of the
prepaid. And just the last question, again, you may have covered this a little bit already, but just I understood from your study that you looked at the use of electricity in the home as part of the sort of attempts to understand the impacts of prepaid metering, and despite the fact that you saw reductions in consumption of electricity, I think my understanding was when you looked at the sort of use of electricity for cooking and baking and things like that in the household, you didn't see significant changes. People were still using electricity for sort of essential sort of tasks. So I mean, did you have an overall view as to whether that reduction in electricity use was having an impact on social welfare?
Well, we haven't we haven't done, particularly the impact of this on social welfare. But what we can see from our analysis is that, people do not reduce, for example, the number of cooking frequency or the number of baking frequency. So in order to understand fully, the impact on social welfare, we need to have, precise indicators for social welfare. So we haven't seen that aspect. What we know is it reduces, electricity consumption. But where that reduction come from? Is it because getting repeated information and nudging from the prepaid meter, or is it because people, reduce their consumption or cooking frequency, or simply sitting in the dark to reduce, electricity? We haven't actually seen that part of the.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Abebe. Ben, just check again. Do we have any other questions for the panelists?
Yes, we have one question, and it goes back to, I think, one of the earlier comments, and it's around smart meters enabling disconnections, utilities to have the information to do so. And the question then is, what are the reasons that utilities may not want to punish non-paying consumers, for example, by disconnecting them? So if prepayment isn't necessarily what is being done, then why wouldn't utilities punish them?
Well, I think I have some research trying to more rigorously answer the question, but if you have a utility where 70% of your consumers are in arrears, then you can't disconnect 70% of your consumers. So disconnection as an enforcement mechanism probably works well when payment is the norm and non-payment is rare, and so you can hold out a very strict penalty for non-payment. Disconnection, universal disconnection, strictly following your contract is realistically infeasible if the norm is non-payment. And I think that's the world in which these utilities find themselves. So then the question is, if say 70% of your consumers are in arrears, then how do you pick and choose who to disconnect? So even with smart meters, the goal cannot be to disconnect everyone who is in arrears. It's just a question of whether if you want to study the impacts of disconnection, whether you kind of have a rule that determines who you disconnect, and then that leads to the question of what that rule should be, or not. But I think that is the challenge for utilities in India, and it's not an easy challenge to solve. We're not going to get there using the contract enforcement tools that are used in contexts with high payment rates.
Okay, thank you. Oh, there's another question that's come up, I think. Ben, do you want to carry on?
Yes, there are two questions here. The first one, perhaps leading on from what was just discussed, is there a correlation between the drop in consumption when prepayment is introduced and the utility adopting such measures? And is this then a deterrent for utility adopting prepayment? I think the second question is more on the regulatory side, whether in fact regulators have become more skeptical using these smart meters. This commentator here notes that in the US there's perhaps some evidence for that. So are we actually seeing the benefits of smart meters? Perhaps I think the other way to frame that question is a lot of the discussion so far has been around the benefits to utilities, but what in fact are the benefits to consumers? Why would anyone opt in? So one around what are these? Is there actually sufficient benefit? And the second question, is there a correlation between the drop in consumption when prepayment is introduced and utilities adopting these things?
I mean, can we just address that second one too, because we've got very little time left. So I'm going to just ask Abebe and Debasish to just give a quick response to this. So just maybe refine the question slightly and or add to it and say, is there a problem for utilities if the introduction of prepaid meters reduces consumption? Does that then reduce revenue and cause an additional problem for utilities? Is there any evidence of that?
From the Bangladesh perspective, what I can say, in Bangladesh, the electricity distribution companies are mostly like the state-owned, the majority shared, owned by the state, the government. So, and the household, the residential electricity is highly subsidized. So if there is any electricity consumption reduction happen due to the self-control mechanism of the customers, I think the distribution company, they can sell this electricity to the industrial sector, because in Bangladesh, actually the market is the electricity utility market is not competitive. Like the on area, on company supply the electricity. So, and the another area, the other company supply the electricity. So for them, in terms of revenue perspective, we didn't analyze this revenue part, what happened in the revenue, but my understanding after talking with the electricity distribution companies people, I think it has less impact on the revenue. Maybe the revenue collection will be reduced from the residential side, but they can shift this electricity to the industry side where the more demand, the electricity has more demand.
Okay, thank you. And Abebe, do you have anything from your side on that? Is reduction in consumption a problem for utility in Ethiopia?
Yeah, the Ethiopian electric utility really focused on expanding or scaling up of this prepaid meter, because they found that the administrative part of this prepaid meter is very, very, very significant. So as I said earlier, we haven't seen the revenue part of this one, but in one of our papers, we find that demand for electricity is inelastic. That means that it's not really sensitive to a changing price. So there is no problem if there is a decrease in consumption by the prepaid owners. Then that, in my opinion, and the others like Jack and Smith in South Africa showed that it will be really compensated by the lower administrative cost from cost in terms of managing the postpaid one. So there will be a gain in terms of revenue, so that it's not going to decrease significantly. In fact, it may affect positively. But this is something that we need to explore further.
Okay. And just on the second question, then maybe put that to Anant and Robyn, which is, are you seeing any, I think the question there was, are you seeing any sort of increased skepticism amongst utilities that you've come into contact with about the usefulness of smart meters? It sounds like it's too early in the process for that, but maybe not. Any comments?
Anant can speak first.
Yeah, go on, Robyn.
Oh, sorry. Okay. So I think we are running into similar issues to what I've seen with to what Anant was describing, where utilities are trying to figure out to what extent they should be enforcing this disconnection rules and things like that. I think the other thing that I want to make sure that I can raise and address is that utilities are also thinking about how to think about meters, whether they be prepaid or smart meters, and other technologies, and sort of using them together, right? So what I've talked a lot with the utilities about is their use of smart meters and things like aerial bundled cables. because they are sort of can be thought about as sort of being used in conjunction with each other, but they're both very expensive, right? So often I think we're seeing utilities are choosing one or the other, like either investing in new meters and smart metering or things like aerial bundle cables. But really, like together, they might actually be addressing some of these issues that are found so often that utilities are struggling with. Because the thing is, even with meters and new meters, people can still go around the meters, right? And so a lot of what we've been talking about up until now has been enforcing bill payment, and that assumes that people are actually getting billed for the electricity services that they're consuming. With a lot of meters, people can still have illegal connections to the wires, and we're seeing that a lot in a lot of settings actually. So in Pakistan, what they've been doing to address losses is actually installing these aerial bundle cables through a lot of Karachi, and we've actually seen that losses and bill payment have been significantly impacted by the aerial bundle cables. And so this is an area that we're just starting to dig into, is sort of trying to think about how do you think about things like those technologies in conjunction with the smart meters. We started to dig into it a bit with our work in Kyrgyzstan. We were finding that, you know, like I said already, in Kyrgyzstan, they're installing smart meters, about 20 to 30% of the customers have them, but they're also installing aerial bundle cables in some areas. So thinking about sort of not just the metering, but sort of what goes with the metering, I think is really important in this discussion, and important for the benefits that the utility gets.
No, that's really important. And just for people who are not familiar, aerial bundle cables are sort of cables that are essentially coated in plastic and very much more difficult for people to just hook connectors onto, and so they help in terms of reducing theft, as Robyn said. We're over time, and I did want to ask, we haven't asked all the questions I wanted to, but I did want to ask one question of all the panelists, so I think I'll do that as our last question, and that is really the need for further research. If you know, in your view, is there a sort of big area of research around a research question that still needs answering around the sort of impacts and usefulness of smart meters or prepaid meters from any perspective, whether it's from the utility perspective or the consumer perspective? So can I just start with Anant, and I'll ask each of you in turn, but if you could be prepared to give a sort of a fairly short, concise answer, it'd be great.
Yeah, I think the two I can think of is, one is to look at alternative tariffs and contracts. Prepaid is one, but there's also time of use pricing and so on. So I think that's one exciting area of work. And I think the other one is something Robyn alluded to, which is more sort of can smart meters let utilities identify where people are not connected to meters at all, sort of where there's energy being injected, but not as much billed consumption. That's not something our study was well suited to doing, but it's a completely different channel through which you might see some impacts. And so that I think there's room for more evidence there.
Okay, great. Thank you, Anand. Abebe?
Thank you, Simon. Well, we have repeatedly discussed about the revenue issue. So one interesting area will be to look at, the cost and the benefit analysis of this prepaid method. So we have some studies in South Africa, very rigorous one, and others some descriptive type of studies. It's better to confirm that this happens in other parts of Africa too. The other one is this. In our case, for example, we use a cross-section data. That's the data collected at the point in time. But it's better to look at the dynamics of this one. Then that may have an impact on, may provide us a full information on the impact of prepaid meter, especially on outcomes like appliance ownership and so on. Probably the last one is we initially proposed to look at the smart meters because the utility informed us to start, just installing smart meters at the residential level, but they couldn't do that. but now they have already started, installing smart meters, particularly for this commercial or business areas. So it's better to look at, the impact of this one on household energy use, on farmers or commercial enterprise energy use, and also how this affects, the administrative revenue and other aspects of the utility. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Abebe. Debasish?
Well, Simon, I think we also need to see the impact of prepaid meter in the manufacturing farm side, because I know in Bangladesh this prepaid meter is also implementing in the low and medium scale of manufacturing industries. So I think it would be better if we explore the impact of prepaid meter on their consumption. So ideally, their consumption should not be, fall. If it is happen like the consumer side, then it would be a serious concern for the electricity or the utility companies, because then it will impact on their revenue for sure. So we are also trying to explore that one. So so let's see like what we find out. Yeah.
Thanks, Debasish. And Robyn, finally, your recommendations for further research.
Yeah, thank you, and thank you for the opportunity to participate. So I would say, sort of complementary to the research that's being done on metering and other technologies, I think sort of thinking about how non-technology type of interventions might complement the technologies. So thinking about, like Anant said, I agree, sort of more on pricing and tariff. I would say also sort of other types of behavioral interventions, sort of understanding how we might, for example, in the case of Pakistan, we're thinking about, given we found low trust with the utility, consumer trust in the utility, how can we sort of might we be able to increase trust in conjunction with these types of metering interventions and things like that. So thinking about sort of non-technological interventions that can sort of potentially complement the technologies.
Okay, brilliant. So thank you very much. That brings us to an end on this webinar. I'd like to thank everybody that joined us for joining us, and I hope you found that interesting. And I'd particularly like to thank our panelists, Abebe, Anant, Debasish, and Robyn for their time and their inputs. If there's anything you've heard today that you want to find out more about in terms of research, please do get in touch with the EG program, and you can find a contact email on our website, and we'll be happy to try and provide you with further information. But thank you very much to all of you, and especially to our panelists today, and also to Ben for helping out, and to Ruth that was managing the whole process. Thank you very much to everybody, and have a good day.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Goodbye.